Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Tales from the Doghouse Separation Anxiety Explained. I am Stacy Bell, and with me today are two very special people.
Hello, it's Ness Jones. I'm from Australia, and I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Karolina Westlund, who is an associate professor of ethology for this episode. And we're going to be talking about emotions and how they relate to separation anxiety and what the dog goes through when they're left home alone and maybe over threshold and panicking, etc., etc. But Dr. Karolina, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. We're really excited to hear your thoughts on this topic. Maybe you could firstly, though, introduce yourself. Tell us, maybe especially for the audience that don't know what ethology is, maybe explain what that is and why you work in this field and what you love about it.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And it's amazing that we managed to find a time slot. It's like 5 a.m. for you, Ness. I'm here in Stockholm, 9 o'clock in the evening. And I don't know where you are, Stacey. Where are you at?
I am
exactly?
On the East Coast in the US in North Carolina.
Yeah. So we're spanning the globe, essentially. So anyway, ethology is the study of animal behavior while wearing an evolutionary biology hat, if you will. So it's trying to understand why animals do what they do, what in nature caused them to evolve the adaptations and the mechanisms they have to deal with their world, essentially. And so when we're applying that to our companion animals, it's applied ethology. And it's one of the many hats I wear. I also know a lot about applied behavior analysis and affective neuroscience, which I think is going to be the topic of today's discussion. It's essentially how emotions and moods, affective states impact behavior, personality, well-being, decision-making. Yeah. Anything that has to do with behavior.
I was really excited. I've done, some just looking at those different things and am wowed by some of the, how moods and emotions can affect perception even. And I mean, I think, it's we all think about how those things can affect our decisions, but how they affect the way we might even perceive a situation. That's kind of like when you start thinking about that. Level of
it is mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling in a way. The what you specifically said right now, that our perception influences, or our moods influence our perception, and thus how we see the world and our decision making, and in the end, our behavior.
And obviously that applies to all animals, with dogs included.
Absolutely. And maybe I should just be very upfront and say I'm not a dog person. I don't work hands-on with dogs. So I know sort of a little about lots of different species. And as I also mentioned, I know a little bit about many different scientific fields. So mine is sort of an overview, whereas I'm guessing that both of you have a very specialized knowledge in the separation anxiety or separation-related problem behavior, perhaps we should say, because I'm not sure that all of it is, in fact, anxiety.
For sure. So in terms of dogs being left by themselves, what do you think is, emotionally, what is going on, do you think? I mean, I agree with you. I mean, and I know Stacey well as well. It's not all anxiety related. Sometimes it's based in other fields, other areas. But in general, let's talk about anxiety. So.
Well, I can again, I haven't worked hands-on with dogs displaying these types of problem behavior, really, but just from an sort of evolutionary and also the emotions perspective, taking into account how I would expect a social animal like a dog to respond emotionally to being left alone in a house for many hours. Let's assume, like 8 hours or something. So being left alone in an environment that's perhaps not not ideal from dogs being another species than we are, with completely different needs than we humans have. I can imagine 4 different emotional responses to that type of situation, and it seems that from what I hear amongst your colleagues looking into separation-related problem behavior, they agree with that. And there's also a recent study, or like 2017 perhaps, by Daniel Mills's group in the UK, I believe, that also confirmed that. And perhaps they would probably describe that a bit perhaps more carefully than I'm doing now, because they're wearing the scientific hat and they don't perhaps have all the data to support that yet. But I'm taking a step back and looking at it, and just sort of from a predictive framework. What I would predict could happen would be 4 different emotional states. So one of them being simply that the animal gets bored. People leave, and now there's nobody to interact with. There's nothing to do because it's just a boring human house with nothing enticing for a dog in it. And so they start showing behaviors that are sort of, they're trying to find ways to entertain themselves. So, going into the trash, or chewing up the sofa, perhaps, or perhaps some destructive behavior. They might be vocalizing and pacing around a bit and sort of uncomfortable, but not anxious, I wouldn't say. Would you say, if I'd throw that ball back to you, would you say that you agree with that? Do some of the separation anxiety behaviors that you see, would that fall into that bucket?
Yeah, for sure.
I think there's definitely dogs that we run into, and it's about looking at, are the dog's needs being met as far as exercise, mental enrichment, species typical behaviors, nutrition, like all of those things. I mean, that is a big part of our framework when we're assessing a dog. And you're going to name 4 things, and just to throw a wrench in it, sometimes it's a combination of things. Sometimes there's
absolutely.
layers there that we have to look
absolutely.
at.
So, I can think of any type of mixture of these 4 buckets, if you will. But if we just start up with the buckets, and then you can add in your sort of take on that. But the second bucket for me would then be more of a frustration type of response. That they're like pissed off to be left home alone, and it's annoying, and there's nothing to do, and they're like they want to get out, so they go for the door. And so we see this, I think, in the literature, is called exit frustration sometimes, that they will destroy points of exit, the doors, and that kind of thing. So that would be the second bucket that I would expect. That the animals would get, bored, and if we're using the affective neuroscience hat, the core emotional state that would be associated with boredom would probably be the seeking system. In other words, that the animal is showing exploratory behavior. They're going into the trash because they're sort of exploring. But the frustration, then we're dipping into another emotional system, which is called the rage system. And that's low-level rage would be frustration. So it's this feeling annoyed. And so we expect different clusters of behavior associated with these different emotional states. But certainly some of these emotional states we can expect to occur that the animal is both in seeking and frustrated at the same time, for instance. And the third bucket, I think that I would expect would to be fear-related behavior, so that the animal feels anxious, uncomfortable about things happening in the environment. So responding to external stimuli. If there's somebody passing by, I would expect them to respond to that. And perhaps that they do that also when the when the person is home, but it gets exacerbated
Mm.
when they're alone. And the other can feed into this, and certainly it can be exacerbated over time, I would also expect. And that the animal doesn't like being alone, but it's not so much a specific relationship with with a specific person, perhaps just not feeling comfortable being on their own, and then being easily. We talk about this negativity bias, and that if you are in a negative mood state and you're slightly anxious, then you're a pessimist. So you see the world as if it's out to get you, and so you will respond to all the noises and all the cars running by, and all the incoming stimuli are potential triggers for this behavior. And then the fourth bucket would be, I guess if I was to use Panksepp's denomination, I would call it the grief system. So it would be a separation-induced discomfort, where it's being separated from specific people leads to a feeling of distress.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you're nodding, are you sort of in agreement with these four buckets, or do you see some other variation of this?
I would say I do like I agree with the four buckets, but I would say the last bucket is the one that we see that we would work with clients the
Yeah,
most with.
yeah.
Like that would be
And
the
I think that's the
main
one that you call
bucket.
anxiety also, right?
Right,
You
right,
call that anxiety, yeah, yeah.
right.
And
And so
yeah.
that would be the bucket that we work most with. But I
Mm-hmm.
would say many of my clients, that would be the primary bucket. And then there might be um, effects from the other three buckets that
Yeah,
exacerbate their
yeah.
experience of
Mm.
their grief system, anxiety
Yeah,
of being separated from their
yeah.
person or people, or just being alone in general.
So will you will your treatment plan be different for individuals out of these different buckets then, would you say?
Yeah, well, they would have different elements added to them. So for the dog that has increased fearfulness or um, a, a response to external stimulus, we
Mm-hmm.
would work on that in addition to
Yeah,
a, a, a plan for being kind of home
yeah,
alone, like a
yeah,
gradual exposure plan for being
yeah,
home alone.
yeah,
And for the dog who's maybe bored or frustrated, we might take a closer look at their daily lives, how their needs are
yeah,
getting met. Can we add things to engage the seeking system in a positive way? Can we, you know, help if we feel like the dog is kind of in that, if you're looking at that kind of core effect space, if they're kind of on that negative side in the balance part of
mm-hmm.
it, if they're kind of on that negative side, are there things that we can do to
To shift them.
either mitigate or some of those things that might be keeping them over there, shifting them over to the right or
Yeah,
more positive
yeah,
emotional state side. So those are all things
mm,
we would look at. And so
yeah,
there are definitely certain tenets that are the same for cases that come to us, but each case
mm,
is a little different in how those pieces might fit together
yeah,
or overlap,
yeah,
or what would be
yeah,
needed there.
yeah.
Yeah, so you can't, obviously, we don't take a blanket approach. We look at each case individually. I think in
Mm.
terms of the first two buckets in particular, with the whole work from home, COVID lockdowns, all those sort of things that went on, there was certainly an element of the dogs not being fearful or anxious, but just having never learnt to be by themselves. And I think we've
Mm.
been tackling a lot of that. So
Yeah,
um, not
yeah,
necessarily based on anxiety, but just completely bewildered by the fact that they're suddenly left
Yeah.
by themselves when they've never
Yeah.
experienced that. So, and we always, look at things like the age of the dog as well. So those, especially the first two buckets, that frustration, boredom thing, if the dog's a teenage dog or a younger dog, we know that they get up to things, that's what they do.
Yeah. So my approach would probably be a lot of what you're discussing here. And I would also assume that maybe there's a risk of mislabeling or putting
Totally.
putting the animal in the wrong bucket. So having an approach that sort of safeguards just in case there's a little bit of frustration in there, that we're also doing something about that. I would guess, but certainly if we can change the animal's overall mood state, that will reduce both the boredom. So having opportunities of doing things and having agency and the sort of the opportunity of showing a varied behavioral repertoire and lots of sniffing and sort of exploratory behavior, that will impact the mood state overall and will probably also diminish both the fear and the panic or the grief, the separation related how easily triggered the animal is by negative emotional experiences. So they'll be more resilient to that, I would assume. And also teaching the animal perhaps to deal with frustration, so that it's sort of manage expectations, that sometimes you don't get what you want, but that's okay because you do some other things happen later on that are fun. So
Right.
yeah.
And I see that I actually saw that a lot, more of that, kind of what people would call demand barking or attention seeking type behavior during COVID, because the people are right there, but they're not always available. So I think a lot of the young dogs that I was seeing were displaying behaviors, pawing at their pet parents or barking during those Zoom calls, or, and I did with those cases take more time to help them set their dog up for success and be proactive with helping their dogs through those things, instead of being like, oh my gosh, my dog is barking and I'm on a Zoom call with my boss, let me give them a juicy bone as they're barking, or you know what I mean, and then you're like, oh no. So
it's easy to inadvertently reinforce those unwanted behaviors. Absolutely.
It totally is.
I'm certainly guilty of that. My cat has me wrapped around his little tail there. He says frog and I jump. Absolutely. Yeah. So those are some thoughts that I have about sort of how emotional states might impact this sort of diverse syndrome of separation related problem behavior. Another thing that I find really interesting is this concept of attachment and how it might impact relationship quality and the propensity to develop separation related problem behavior. And one thing that I actually stumbled on today as I was sort of reading up a little bit on this before our talk here was that this concept in the dog industry that's called hyperattachment. Have you heard that expression, hyperattachment? Yeah. As far as I know, and it could be that I just missed it, but as far as I know, there's no such term in the human attachment dictionary at all. And I think it's a misnomer, actually, because if you look at what a dog who's supposedly showing hyperattachment is doing, in human terms, that would be called insecure attachment.
Yeah. And so I think the Mills study talks about that. If I have my studies right, and it sounds like you just looked at it, but I think the Mills study does talk a little bit about the attachment types that we talk about in the human world and how that
Mm,
might relate to different behaviors we're seeing surrounding separation related problem behaviors, and which
mm,
ones might map to which behaviors we're seeing,
mm.
and that sort of thing. So that is an interesting discussion. And if
It
you'll
was, yeah,
allow, go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, no, go ahead.
No,
You
I
had
just
something
have
you
like
wanted
a
to.
question, right? So in humans, a lot of the talk around that attachment theory and what type of attachment develops um, stems from their kind of early childhood experiences with their primary carers. So, like in a traditional home, their mom and dad. But with dogs, you have this experience with their dog mom, and then transferred over to their pet parents. And
Mm.
so I'm wondering if you have thoughts on those different attachment styles. Are they likely being formed with their dog mom or their person pet parent? Or both.
I Yeah, yeah, and it's an excellent question, I think, and I think that both, and I think also that the fact that we um, our weaning practices typically dictate that we separate puppies at what, 8 weeks or something from
Yeah.
their dog mum and dog siblings, and that we pick them up out of their familiar environment and dump them in a novel environment with their new human family, and perhaps other
Mm-hmm.
dogs too, but all strangers. And that is a rupture of attachment bonds. And
Okay.
it's in my, from if I'm wearing the ethological hat and looking at the timing of when that occurs, it's at the worst possible moment. It's mind-boggling to me that we do that and that we haven't really explored. There's very little research on what would happen if we let dogs stay until 12 or 14 weeks before we did that separation. There is some sort of data from the 60s of what happens if you separate them at 4 weeks or six, or and that's very, very detrimental. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I would just assume that they would make that transition more easily a little bit later.
There are some
Um,
breeders doing that, but there's not that many of them. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it would be really interesting to have to do some academic
Some
studies on
later
that
ones. Yeah.
to really document what's going on with and of course the such breeders would then have to do a lot of what we might consider socialization, that
Right.
the
Mm-hmm.
training of the sort of teaching the young puppy a little bit of what it is to live with humans. Yeah. But I think it does predispose dogs. So dogs are essentially orphans. They're separated
Mm-hmm.
early and they're predisposed to what is referred to as insecure attachment. Essentially, a secure attachment relationship is when here's mom, or the attachment figure, whether it's a human or a dog, dog mom, and here's the baby. And so the baby in a secure attachment, the baby knows that mom is reliable and safe, and I can count on her. I can trust her to be there. So they will, if they're hurt, they'll come running. So there'll be proximity seeking, and there will be like a safe haven. You return to the safe haven when you feel sad or you've hurt, gotten hurt or scared or something. You return to your safe haven, and she helps with co-regulation. So your nervous system can then go back to relaxation again. And this is the really interesting bit, I think, is that we then get um, this uh, this exploratory behavior. And there's a term within attachment psychology. What's it called? It's called
Secure base? No, it's not
yes,
the
it's a
secure
secure
base
base.
from
So
which
yeah,
they do
so
their
mom, yeah,
okay.
yeah. So here's mom, and she's the secure base from which I go off to explore. So what we'll see with securely attached kids, and I suspect also dogs, is that they actually explore more. They'll leave mom and move away further than the insecurely attached babies, or perhaps then also dogs. And they also, if there's a separation, they'll react to that. They won't like it, and they'll do a little protest, but then they'll calm down because they can also self-regulate, so they can calm down. And when mom comes back, there will be some reunion behavior also. Whereas the insecurely attached kids are, they don't know that mom is going to be there. They don't trust that because she's been inconsistent in her behavior or his behavior. Typically, it's actually mothers tend to be the primary caregivers, so the first attachment figure tends to be to the mum. But that means that she's not such a safe haven. So it's less of co-regulation going on. So it's more difficult for the infant or young one to relax in their presence, and they don't also take as big excursions. They don't do these the secure base behavior as much or as extended as a securely attached baby, or I suspect also dogs, because from what I hear from the researchers studying attachments behavior in dogs, they do transfer it to humans. So there's an attachment relationship going on from dogs to humans and also from humans to dogs. And apparently it seems that at least a safe or a secure attachment, and also where you've introduced the dog to careful socialization, so you've taken them to new places and they've met other individuals and so on, that will then reduce the risk of them developing any of these separation related problem behaviors. So it seems that a secure attachment is in a way a safeguard towards that. And it also seems to me, when I sort of understand a bit about what's going on with many of the dogs that were labeled as hyper attached, which in my book really is just one of the insecure attachment, the clingy insecure attachment, that they show a lot of following behavior, and that they wouldn't be able to self-regulate when they're alone to the same extent that a securely attached individual might. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess that this sort of, from my perspective, I would, in order to avoid these types of troubles, I would look at the weaning procedure, how that is carried out, when and how it's carried out. And I would also look at how can we prepare the animal for alone time later on, but in such a way that it's not overwhelming, that we introduce these little moments of being alone, just a few seconds, and then gradually increasing that, and that the animal learns that it's okay. Sometimes I'm on my own for a moment, and then everything is fine again. So that they learn that from early on, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Ness.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I like the analogy of if you were teaching a toddler to swim, if you wanted to teach them to swim, you're not going to take them in the deep end and shove them off into the pool, let them struggle and learn, talk about learning the hard way. You're going to make it so that they, go take them to the shallows, let them go and gradually, and just like you say, in those short absences, so they feel safe and confident in the water or being home alone. Rather than
such an important point you're making there, Ness, I think, because if you're thrown into the deep end of the pool, not only is it hard to cope with that situation if you don't have the skills, but also it's you experience a very, very severe negative emotional reaction to that. And we know that very distressing situations wreak havoc with with our physiology and our decision making and our behavior. So we get this shift of the mood state, and we get this fear learning perhaps going on, that, oh my God,
Mhm.
when mom leaves, I'm going to feel bad. So then we get
Yeah.
the learned association with mom leaving, that starts so we get this vicious circle where it can just become worse and worse and worse if we haven't been able to teach these um, controlled short-term absences that where the animal is just fine. Mm.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well when we're one of, I think, the most damaging um kind of old pieces of advice that people give surrounding puppies and alone time is just let them cry it out. And
Ah,
that's that intensely negative experience for some puppies. And I wish that we could just replace that piece of advice with that
mm,
initial exposure is so important. That first time that they're alone, making that a positive experience is going to
yeah.
set your puppy up for just more resilience in
Oh,
being
yeah, yeah,
home alone.
yeah,
And
yeah,
just so yes. Yes,
yeah.
I
But I think they need to be really, really short also, just a matter of seconds, those first
very
few
short,
times.
yes.
Very, very short. Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
No, it's crying it out is I think also from an emotional perspective is because if it works, say that you leave the child or the dog is crying, 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 stops crying. That to me is they're actually going into a despair state. It's not that they're okay with being alone. It's that the stress response is going into another phase, if you will, because and we know that the if we look at what's happening physiologically, it's that the animal is going into a conservation state, because if you both that you need to conserve energy because the crying didn't help, so you need to conserve energy, and also if you keep crying you might attract the wrong attention. So
Right.
it's adaptive for animals to cry for a while to get the attention of mom, because being alone when you're that small is dangerous. So you need to cry out so that she can find you. And if she doesn't come, you need to keep silent. Otherwise, the hyenas are going to come and get you. And so for
Hmm.
me, the idea of using that as a technique to get the animal or the young human infant for that matter,
Hmm.
the cry it out technique is absolutely appalling, actually. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really heartbreaking. Would you say that many of the things that we're talking about here are pretty standard across like social species in mammals, or is it widely different typically if you're looking at people, primate and other primates, and dogs, and does it vary a lot, or
Um,
is it pretty standard?
as far as I know, most species do not show attachment in the way that this strong social bond is formed, where the absence of that particular individual is distressing. It's been shown in primates and dogs, and I believe also cats, but not horses, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and interestingly, in interspecifically between dogs and humans.
Right.
And I think also between cats and humans. Not sure humans and cats if they've done that study even, but I think for
There,
some cat people,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I know that there
Um,
are some practitioners who are applying the methods that we use with dogs to cats who are struggling with
yeah,
separation.
yeah.
And with
And I would,
horses, what I've seen is just the conspecific. So like if the
Yes.
horse is separated from the herd, but I don't think I've heard of,
Yeah.
and listeners, let us know because that would be an interesting one, but of like their carer being separate from them, if that would throw a horse into experiencing anxiety or frustration or whatever. That's an
Yeah,
interesting one.
that's not to say that they don't form strong positive
Mm-hmm.
relationships with both their own species or humans, but it's just this concept of attachment where it's such a strong bond, and typically we one of the ways to determine the quality of the attachment bond is to do what's referred to as the strange situation. It's a test where you the caregiver comes with the child or the dog into a room, and there's a stranger in the room, and then the caregiver leaves, and we look at how the child or the dog interacts with the environment and the stranger, and then we look at what happens when the caregiver comes back. So this is sort of the way to capture or encapsulate what attachment is all about. And so I think that when they try to do that with horses, they don't see the same type of attachment related behaviors that as we would see in dogs or humans. But that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that the horses that they don't form relationships and friendships, and that separation, from the filly from the mare isn't much too early in horses too, which I believe they are as well. I think that's also one of those areas where it seems that with cats, we're actually doing it right. We're letting cats, at least in Sweden nowadays, we're letting cats stay with mom until they're 14 weeks, which seems to be well beyond the time where they sort of, a lot of the social learning that needs to occur has happened by then. But whereas we with both dogs and horses, we separate them too early. And from me looking at it from an evolutionary ethological perspective, it spells problems. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a recipe. It would really, if you were just looking at it from a theoretical perspective, I would say, oh well, I would, doing early separations like that, I would really expect this to become problematic. And so I don't think we have much data on it to really show that that is the case, but from a sort of theoretical perspective, we can certainly predict it.
Can you talk a little bit more about kind of mood state or emotions and how that affects our perceptions and how that might affect our decisions? Because I just think that's a fascinating piece. And I know that we kind of mentioned that at the beginning of our talk, but if you could unpack that a little bit more for our listeners, I would just love it.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, um, um, affective or affective reactions are these experiences we have when challenging things happen in the environment or internally also that we need to respond to threats, or we need to find resources or so things happen in the environment that trigger a physiological reaction with often some type of subjective sensation. So we feel happy and excited, or sad and depressed, or scared and anxious, or serene and calm. All right. So we have this short-lived emotional reaction to stimuli, and emotions tend to be short-lived. In my interpretation of this term, and if you go to the scientific literature, there are actually over 90 definitions of emotion. So,
Wow.
it really depends on who you're talking to. But for me, I'm using sort of Panksepp's definitions of that they're short-lived. There's this physiological response to stimuli or events that trigger then a behavior reaction that somehow resolves the situation, because it's really in response to relevant life or death type of situations where you need to get resources, have sex, take care of babies, avoid predators, and find shelter, those types of things. And so the emotions are short-lived, but since we're constantly having these emotional reactions, things are happening all the time. we tend to spend most of our time in a cluster of emotional reactions. And over time, so if you mentioned this concept called core affect space, where we're mapping emotions in a two-dimensional space where we have arousal on the y-axis, so how quickly and intensely animals respond to the stimuli. So if we're comatose, we would be down here, and if we're really, really excited, we're up here. And then also the second dimension, the x-axis is then is valence, so it's from unpleasant to pleasant. And so when we're having these emotional responses or experiences, we're sort of moving around in this core affect space, but since we tend to have many similar experiences, if we live in a dangerous environment, we tend to have many negative emotional reactions. And if we live in a sort of pleasant environment, we tend to have pleasant emotional reactions. And so these emotional reactions aggregate over time and constitute our mood state. So moods if emotions span over like milliseconds to seconds to minutes, perhaps, moods span from minutes to hours, days, weeks, or even months, because that's where we spend most of our time. And the mood state will then tend to recalibrate the whole physiology of the animal, the whole autonomic state, so that if we live in a dangerous environment, our system needs to be extremely vigilant because there are dangers about. So we need to be very geared in to hear noises associated with dangers, and to pay attention to those and respond accordingly, and also to respond very much to certain visual stimuli. So our perception will literally change. This is some really interesting studies on humans showing that your hearing range, the interval in which you can perceive tones, will shift if you're in a negative emotional state versus if you're in a positive emotional state.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's essentially that you're wearing different glasses depending on whether you're in a pessimistic or an optimistic mood state. You will see the world completely differently, and you will then interpret what you're seeing very differently depending on whether you're in a negative mood state or a positive mood state. And so I'm thinking that if we can help animals obtain a positive mood state, the fact that they are then left alone at home for a couple of hours will be interpreted very differently depending on whether they're in a negative, pessimistic mood state or if they're in a positive, optimistic mood state.
And that is something we do work on with our clients, is trying to build up that positive mood state. Yeah, it is really, really interesting. And helping the dog to be an optimist, and and like you say, all that scent work is so things like that. So
I hear that one of the myths surrounding separation related problem behavior is that supposedly you have this, it's all your fault because you've spoiled the dog. Right?
Oh, totally. I had a lady in my Facebook group, and she was accused of spoiling her dog and creating separation related behaviors, because she took the dog for a walk and she groomed the dog. She took the dog to the park and she groomed it, and then she had created this problem because of loving her dog and doing normal doggy stuff with it. It's crazy.
If anything, I would suspect that it would be just the other way around, that you're actually sort of 100%. Inoculating the animal, that by spoiling, by giving the dog many positive emotional experiences, because that would essentially be what spoiling would be all about, that we're sort of making sure that they're an optimist, that actually lessens the likelihood of them developing separation related problem behavior, I would suspect. I don't
Yeah.
know if there's any data to support that, but from the theoretical perspective, that's what I would expect.
There's, the only studies that I have seen is that spoiling is not related to
Yeah,
an increase in separation
yeah,
anxiety, but I
but
haven't
not that
seen that.
it reduces the risk.
Right, right.
No,
I've
all
not
right,
seen
yeah,
that, but I would think
yeah,
the same, just because it's all about, you know, meeting your dog's needs. And
yeah,
you would think that, you know, in making sure their welfare is taken care of, that um that then they are in a more positive mood state, and then that
yeah,
would cause them to then, like you said, interpret Home Alone time in a
yeah,
more positive
yeah.
sense. So
Mm.
what are some tips that you have? Ness mentioned some of the seeking related stuff, and I know there's a lot of enrichment surrounding seeking, food scatters, you know, boxes with stuff in it for them to seek out their food, nose work
Mm.
kind of things. Are there
Uh,
other tips that you have for helping to move dogs kind of along that x-axis, that valence, to the
yeah.
more positive side?
Yeah, I think that we can, if we're looking at, if we're combining the core effect space, this
Mm-hmm.
matrix, and trying to move them to the positive side, and we're combining that with Panksepp's concepts of the different core emotions. There are 4 core emotions that are on the positive side, and there are 3 that are on the negative side. So I would say that if in order to make that transition, we need to address both. So diminish the
Right.
negative core emotion. So uh, try to avoid having the animal living through fearful episodes. So no flooding, or no sort of exposing the animal to unpleasant situations. Punishment is typically something that tends to evoke negative emotional reactions, and it's typically rather ineffective and has heaps of other side effects as well. So it's just
Right.
not a way we want to
Mm-hmm.
advise people to go down that road. So reducing fear and reducing rage also. So having the animal be, having to feel anger or aggressive behavior. Um, so so that would be sort of diminishing those, and then
Mm-hmm.
also encouraging the positive emotional states. And we touched on seeking, and I think that one of the
There.
things that you dog people are doing that's so really interesting, I think, is this concept of nose work. That I think we're just starting to see just how much of a shift can be achieved through that, because it seems that it has massive impact. I know that there's some new um, there's a PhD student looking into that. So hopefully in a couple of years' time, we'll know more about some of the effects of nose work. Really
Mm-hmm.
exciting. We can
Yes.
also look into because I mean, dogs are evolved from their wolf ancestors, and wolves, when they do so, when we're trying to promote seeking behavior, it's really about the animal's natural foraging sequence, and trying
Mm-hmm.
to see if we can stimulate different aspects or different responses within that hunting sequence. So when it comes to dogs, different breeds have retained different parts of the wolf hunting sequence. So we have the orient behavior, the eyeing, stalking behavior, the chasing behavior, the grabbing, the kill, bite, and the
Yeah.
dissection, and then just the eating. So different breeds tend to sort of specialize in different parts of the sequence. And so sort of finding out where your breed or your individual, because they're
Mm-hmm.
not all individuals conform to the expectations we might have
True. Mm-hmm.
from their breeds.
Mm-hmm.
If we can find ways of engaging them in that hunting sequence in a way that's safe, of course, will
Right.
help make that transition. But I think that probably nose work would work with all dogs.
Mm.
Chasing flirt balls or something might not work with all dog breeds, but certainly it seems that
Right.
nose work is something that we can engage every single dog
Yeah.
with. And so that would be the seeking system. And then there's the care system, which is essentially typically how we use that would be to through gentle touch, massage, T-touch, or just hanging out together and breathing really slowly. Not all dogs, not all people like being touched, but just
Yeah.
hanging out and sort of this co-regulation thing that we can just sort of hang out and be calm and relax together can really help this transitioning the autonomic nervous system from a fight and flight to a more relaxed and pro-social state is really beneficial in making that transition. Then we have the play system, which is a highly aroused, and that involves the sympathetic nervous system also. So it's like a sympathetic and, never mind the terminology, but just it's high arousal, happy emotional states. So lots of rough and tumble play, finding a playmate. And I learned from my friend Tess Erngren that different dog breeds play in different ways. So that if you have a breed who likes to chase, then a good match would be to find another dog that also likes chasing games rather than one that likes to ram them or bite or something. Whereas for another breed, it might be that they like to wrestle or something. Yeah. So just finding a good playmate to encourage that type of behavior. And it could be if the animal is very shut down or very anxious, that they can't play because you only play once you feel safe. So they need to feel safe first before that play can develop. And the fourth core, just to finish off this discussion, the fourth core emotion would be lust. So having sex, maybe not practical for most purposes, but anyway, I thought I should just mention it. That would be, it would classify within that those different buckets. Yeah. Sorry, you were saying.
No, I was just going to say,
Daisy.
Like you were saying with the care piece and the play piece, I think one of the things that people are generally getting good at is doing some consent type testing to make sure that the dog is having a good time or receiving that touch in the way that it was intended, as opposed to like, because my own dog doesn't love to be cuddled or hugged, and so somebody hugging it, he would just be like, like just tolerating it, and that's not what we're talking about here as far as that goes. So the whole consent and making sure that the dog is enjoying that with both play. And I love the point you made about the different play styles and making sure that you if you're playing with your dog, that you're playing in a way that your dog enjoys, or if they're playing with another dog or animal, that's something that your dog enjoys. And consent tests could be used.
Dr. Karolina, you have a whole course on consent and choice, don't you?
Oh, I have a course on animal emotions, certainly.
Yes, I know you've got
where
that.
I talk a lot about all the concepts, core emotions, and the core effect space also, and I do touch on consent there. It's interesting what you said, Stacey, about your dog, because my cat is sort of the same. He's tolerant, but he doesn't really enjoy petting that much. He does enjoy being brushed by his brush, so I can because I want to touch him, right? But but he doesn't want. So it's a sort of compromise where I get to handle him a little bit longer, and he actually leans into it and asks. He goes, "Oh yeah, more there."
Right here,
like
right
that.
here.
So he's yeah. So he's really showing that he wants it. But it's such an important point that you made there. I think that we're paying a lot more attention to now than we did 10 years ago. Also, that the importance of consent and how much I think waiting for the consent before touching an animal can actually improve the quality of the relationship compared to if we don't listen to the animal or pay attention.
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
It's 10 o'clock there now, Karolina.
Yeah, there you go. Time flies.
Yeah. So we should probably wrap up, unless you've got any more questions, Stacey.
Well, I could talk to you forever, Dr. Karolina, but I think I don't have any other questions written down. Do you have any parting points that you want to make before we wrap up?
No, not. I just appreciated talking to you because, again, I don't work hands-on, which is why I was asking questions also. Maybe you hadn't expected that, but I always find it really interesting to have these conversations where we can add our different perspectives and grow the image a little bit by showing these different, combining the practical and the theoretical perspective. I think it's really interesting. So thank you both.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I loved it.
And
where can people
links? Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, so where can people find you? Yeah, and I was going to say all your links will be, or your link to your website will be in the show notes. But maybe you could tell us as
perfect. Well. Yeah, it's the name of my company is ILLIS Animal Behavior Courses, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, and I also have a website. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's got really, really excellent some blog articles and courses, and sometimes you even have some short courses to give people a taste of what maybe some of the larger courses are. So some really, really valuable information there. So check it out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely worthwhile. Dr. Karolina, thank you so much. Really love talking to you. And
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for joining us this week, listeners. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.